Josh White, and this is Globalists, the new podcast from the battleground. The Russia war on Ukraine has entered a new phase, one where each side is hitting the other with much more powerful fire, a war of attrition. And the death toll is rising, and the tit-for-tat attacks are escalating. So we have to ask ourselves, is this leading to a resolution of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or simply more bloodshed? Joining me to discuss this question is my co-host, Mitchell Plitnick.
Hi, Josh. Um, so I think the what we're seeing is definitely a new phase in the Ukraine-Russian war, one that Ukraine has some real advantages in. Ukraine has, um, the drone warfare that capabilities that it has are very well suited to the kinds of attacks it's now launching, and the missiles that it has been given by the United States that were in the past they were restrained from using to their full capacity. They were restricted in what they could target. They basically couldn't target Russia at all. They could only target the battlefield in eastern Ukraine. Those restrictions have been lifted, and it's made a big difference. And the real question now, and what's not at all clear, is what the Ukrainian ambitions are, because they still have some limitations, and we're seeing them within Ukraine. So just in this past week, we saw the defense minister Mykhailo Fedorov was dismissed, and that did not sit well with most Ukrainians. He's a very popular defense minister. He approaches strategy, military strategy, from a point of view that values the lives of Ukrainian soldiers much more than the current lead general, who is seen as basically somebody who takes a similar sort of strategy to Russia, where he uses soldiers basically as cannon fodder. And that has created some severe problems in Ukraine as well, because they're experiencing, as they have throughout the war, a shortage of recruits for the Ukrainian army, and now those tensions have really escalated. There has been violence. In fact, one recruiter, I believe, was killed. There's been a number of violent episodes where recruiters were attacked and chased off. Uh, and quite a number of cases where we've seen recruiters just snatching people off the streets, sometimes violently assaulting them, and in some cases doing that to people who are not supposed to be drafted into the military, who have papers that say that they are not supposed to be drafted into the military. There's one particular case where that happened to somebody, and yeah, they didn't send them to the front lines, but they did send them to the hospital with some pretty severe injuries. There is a lot of those sorts of tensions. There are protests now in Ukraine around Fedorov's dismissal, and around just, I think, the general tone and tendency of the war, which does not seem to be drawing to an end. By the same token, I think the fact that Ukraine has had more impact, not just on Russian population centers directly, which has happened, but also on Russia's energy supply. Um, they are no longer, for example, they've had to suspend all exports of diesel because they need it for domestic use. And Ukraine has destroyed something like 40% of their production capacity. So, Russians are really feeling the impact of the war now in a way they never have before. It should um, create pressure for on both sides to finally end this war. Um, Whether or not it will, is unclear, because neither Vladimir Putin nor Volodymyr Zelenskyy have indicated that that's the direction they want to go in. And the tough talk at the recent NATO summit doesn't help. There was a lot of, I mean, basically, there was a move to create a bank, an international bank, that would institutionalize funding for Ukraine. So that envisions a much longer war. which I think the impact of that would be really tragic on a number of levels. Not the least of which is the fact that the Russian invasion of Ukraine, for all the horrors that there have been, it has been a war that mostly took took its toll on combatants, and that's changing. We're seeing more and more civilians getting hurt, especially in Ukraine, but on both sides. So, and that's likely to escalate. And we shouldn't ignore the fact that all of this combines with the war in the Persian Gulf to seriously jeopardize the global economy in terms of not just energy supply but food supply, where fertilizer was threatened in the Persian Gulf, as we know, and just the grain that comes out of the breadbasket of Europe. That arrangements had been made early in this war to sort of affect to allow the export of grain to continue to move. Who knows how stable that's going to be? So there's a lot of reason to get to a resolution of this war. Whether or not it's actually going to happen, that's a little dubious because it doesn't seem like anyone's pushing very hard. Although the one bit of hope, there was an odd report I saw today out of Azerbaijan that said that German leaders had met with Russian envoys in Azerbaijan, unbeknownst to the Azerbaijani government. So they were doing that independently. The release said, we don't know what they talked about. We just know they met from travel data. So maybe there's something going on behind the scenes between Europe and Russia to come to some sort of understanding that they can then convince Ukraine of. We'll see, but I hope something gives because this is an opportunity to do that.
That would be a positive twist, wouldn't it? Because up until now, at least for a long period of this conflict, we've seen very little action from European governments in terms of active diplomacy that diverges, especially from the US under Trump. Um, they seemed a bit more assertive in the Biden period, if I'm not mistaken, in my memory. I'm not sure what you think about that, but they've certainly become a lot more reticent to clash or diverge from the kind of Trumpian line on this war. And that's the other irony in all of this, that Trump is increasingly open to Ukraine in terms of aid and in terms of fewer strings attached. And that is a break from his own rhetoric historically on this war. Um, just as the Iranian conflict, the conflict with Iran rather, is a break with the so-called isolationism of MAGA and a break with that kind of rhetoric around forever wars. Um, and over here in the UK, we're undergoing a political change right now in terms of who's running the country. But the Ukraine policy is going to be one of the planks of relative continuity. And we'll get into that a bit more as we discuss this, I think.
I think you pointing out the shift in Trump. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess it depends on how you look at it. Uh, this is the this is the result of Trump's own capriciousness. I think the bromance, the famous bromance between him and Vladimir Putin has ended. I think he feels that he has finally come to see that Putin doesn't have much respect for him, which I think we can all see long ago. Uh, but I think Trump convinced himself of, as he convinces himself of so many things. uh, I shouldn't get too far into his psychology, but what I think is clear is that uh, the Trump himself, as well as those around him, have been able to look at Russia's support of Iran in this war and their help. The help that they've given Iran, which has been both indispensable and very underreported, um, that has been a significant factor, and I think it really burns Trump, who has in fact gone out of his way to make the case publicly for many years that we should talk to Russia, that Putin's not such a bad guy, etc. Um, it was an unsuccessful case because Putin has a way of undermining anybody who says he's not such a bad guy by showing that, yeah, he's a pretty bad guy. Um, and now he has finally, I think, sort of turned on Putin, and that has facilitated his change in policy, where he has lifted so many of the guardrails around Ukraine that Biden put in place to prevent escalation. And I think that was something that um, I felt like that was something that Europe sort of agreed with, but there was some debate about, and it's went sort of back and forth. My view always was, from the beginning of this, that the United States had not done nearly enough to prevent this war, and once it started, it pursued a strategy that led to a prolonged war rather than a quick one. In other words, either don't help Ukraine at all so the war ends, or give it all the help you can so that they will win the war, but don't do this sort of middle ground thing that just leads to years and years, which is what we've gotten, of destruction and killing. Um, and unfortunately, that was the policy. Now, at this stage, has Trump changed that? It's not entirely clear that he has. I'm not sure it's necessarily a good thing if he does, because if you are going to go all in on the strategy of opening, of hitting Russia hard so that they will want to end the war, you have to actually add that second component where you're trying to end the war. And there's no evidence of that yet. So, um, so we will have to see. And it is clear. I mean, from what I can tell, and you know better than I do, but from what I can tell, I don't see a lot of hope that the UK will play an aggressive role in this. Again, I go back to that sort of strange report out of Azerbaijan regarding Germany. Germany is and has been the key player in this in Europe. And if they decide that they're going to talk to Russia, that could be a major turning point.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see if anything comes out of that. That's potentially crucial if that's the case. Here in the UK, though, we're definitely in a very different moment. We're very much engaged in navel gazing as we change government, or at least leadership of the government, with the exit of Keir Starmer and the coming to power of Andy Burnham. He's composed his cabinet, including Ed Miliband as Foreign Secretary, and interestingly making John Healey Chancellor, which is a bit of a surprise for many people. For anyone unaware, Healey was previously overseeing defence and was very much a hawk and pushing for far greater military spending. So he's taken over the Treasury, but Miliband taking over the Foreign Office is probably a sign of relative restraint and a degree of expertise in foreign policy, which is probably positive for Labour right now. How does this affect Ukraine policy? I bet it probably means continuity to a large degree, especially when it comes to providing aid and arms to Ukraine. But there's very little sign of a diplomatic push, an independent diplomatic push, as we might characterize it, because that's desperately what we need from European governments right now. And publicly, there's very little sign of it, fortunately.
I mean, we need that from European governments in general, I think. Yeah,
Yes.
unfortunately, we have a situation in Washington. Look, I was, and I got a lot of criticism for my dislike of Joe Biden's policy towards Ukraine, as I mentioned. I was espousing a view that fit neither with the pro-Russian left the pro-peace left or the realist centrist right, that whole sort of foreign policy group, um, in criticizing Biden's policy. But Biden did have a policy. Biden did have a strategy. There was, whether it was his or his people, whatever it was, um, there was a strategy. The idea of degrading Russia, the idea of putting the United States and NATO back as key players in the world, on the world stage. I think those were key agenda items for Biden, and it succeeded in both of those things. Um, but Trump has no strategy at all. Trump has he came in with this sort of, I'm going to solve the Russia Ukraine war in 30 days nonsense, which I don't know anyone who took that seriously. Even I don't even think the maggots took that seriously. Um, the the one summit after another, first humiliating Zelensky, and then holding summits as if this summits did anything. It just showed a complete misunderstanding of the role of such high profile meetings, which are to cap off years, months, or sometimes years of negotiations to come to an agreement. And then you have the summit where you actually sign the thing. Just Trump has no understanding of how these things work, and the people around him are not people who are either interested in peace, in the case of his Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and people like Mike Waltz, the ambassador to the UN, or there are people that have no experience in this sort of thing, who are isolate the isolationists who want to extricate the United States from all of this international entanglement, but don't know how. That would be J.D. Vance, and Trump, who just has no idea at all, and just follows his whims on a daily basis, as if the world was his plaything. I mean, I can't imagine a situation where leadership from Europe is more desperately needed and more conspicuously absent. Uh, and I come back to this fear of Trump and his capriciousness and his ways of lashing out. And I just have to ask myself, what exactly do you think is going to be worse? Uh, what is the UK and the EU? What are they afraid of? That could be so much worse than allowing Trump essentially free reign over these international affairs. I just don't know what that would be. He's crashing the global economy. What more are you scared of? He's threatening to, blow up these conflicts. I mean, we are getting to a place where there's more interaction in terms of effect between the war on Iran and Russia's war on Ukraine. And, as I mentioned earlier, in the energy markets and food markets, these things are going to start really, compounding each other in a much greater way as time goes on. So we're talking the potential for World War III there. What more can Europe possibly be afraid of with Trump, than these outcomes? I just don't know what that is. But whatever it is that's feeding what I would have to call cowardice, is it is severely endangering this entire planet.
It boggles the mind. If we skip back to the Iraq War, you had a serious attempt by European governments to build some kind of political opposition. You had, of course, President Chirac in France. You had Schroeder in Germany. You had attempts at a kind of unity with Russia and China on this as well. I mean, the conditions are radically different with this war and with the Iran war, of course. But it's still astounding that there isn't anything approaching that kind of political or even diplomatic alternative building. Maybe we should call it that. And certainly we're not going to see it from the UK, I fear. Although maybe Burnham will surprise us, but I'm skeptical right now that they're going to suddenly stand up to Trump on this sort of thing. If there's no sign of it on the European continent, where historically there's been a bit more bravery on this issue, at least historically, from France at least, and to some extent Germany on occasion, at least on Iraq. Then there's very little hope, I think, of it happening in the UK, at least not from our political class. And that's where it comes down to movement building and campaigning on the ground, which there has been a fair amount, to be fair. Although the kind of anti war movement, as you might call it, has been divided over Ukraine, especially in the UK, where you have a kind of, just like in the US, you have a split between kind of pro Russia left elements and pro Ukraine elements. And that's a major obstacle for actually pushing for any kind of alternative policy or strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to. I don't want to minimize the fact that there are real concerns involved in diplomacy to end this war. I think any realistic ending of this war does not include a Russian withdrawal from the territories it has already captured, and I think most people have come to recognize that. I said that early on, and I got called all kinds of names, but now by now most people I think have come around to that point and recognize that there's really no way to get Russia out of the Donbass, that it has at least a part of the Donbass that it has captured, which is why I think Russia ended up. Once they recognized that their initial ambitions to topple Kyiv were not going to be recognized, I think they sort of moved their sights to just being able to capture the entire Donbass region, which there's of course no reason to allow them, and that should not be something that would be on the table on the other side. So I think the problem with that is that one of the problems with that is that it is really the first time since the end of World War II that the international community would then recognize or have to at least accommodate the acquisition of territory by force. Territory has been acquired by force since then, but the world has always objected to it, whether it's China and Tibet, and you know, except for the United States, of course, Morocco and Western Sahara, uh, obviously Israel and the Palestinian territories. Um, these things have happened, but the world hasn't accepted it, and now we're talking about a situation where the world might be at least de facto forced to accept Russia's acquisition of territory, and that's a big deal. I do think that's not something to be taken lightly, and I understand why many people look at that and say we just can't do that. It sets a dangerous precedent. It does. I agree, but this war is just so destructive that I think there there's there's really no better alternative. I think also the hysteria, and I do call it hysteria, about this idea that Russia, having at least achieved something in this invasion of Ukraine, will then start looking at other parts of Eastern Europe and trying to sort of recreate the the Soviet sphere of influence and that kind of. I just find that to be fantastical, because I think the opposite is actually the case. I think what happened here is that Russia thought, Putin thought specifically, that he could walk into Ukraine, basically smash their military, and topple the government in Kiev and put back in power a regime that was friendly to Moscow. And that was immediately shown not to be true. It was shown not to be true in the short term, as a quick strike, which was his initial strategy, and it was shown to be impossible through a longer war of attrition, despite the massive difference between the size of the Russian and Ukrainian militaries. So after that, how is it that that anyone thinks he's going to now turn around and attack NATO countries? That thinking I just don't get. He's clearly been deterred from that, and I think that should be acceptable. I don't. So that part of it I don't credit, but I do credit the point about accepting Russia's acquisition of this territory, accepting their annexation of Crimea, accepting their dominance in the Donbass, most of it. Um, that is a bad thing. It is a setback for the world. And, I would argue that different policies in the 1990s and early 2000s would have led to a different outcome. I think that's what we're paying for now, uh, which in no way lets Russia off the hook, because those are criminal acts, and that's absolutely the case. So, um, just saying that we are going to have to bite some bullets here is what I guess I'm getting at, and I do think that the war in the Persian Gulf and the escalations that we're seeing now, because we are seeing some major escalations. I mean, Ukraine just launched 400 drones at Russia uh, a day ago. Um, we're seeing the targeting of all sorts of infrastructure on both sides. And Ukraine, everyone forgets, I think, sometimes, because we so often see, normal day-to-day life in parts of Kyiv when we look at the news, but Ukraine's been devastated. Um, its population's been severely diminished, and its economy is crippled. It's going to take a long time for Ukraine to recover from this war, and this world is just not capable of withstanding all of this at the same time. Action is simply required, and some of it is going to entail doing things that we don't like to do.
Yeah, that is the difficult kind of crux of the matter, isn't it, from a European political class perspective, I think. So many people just don't want to concede any ground in this. And that's understandable to a large degree, I think, given that this was, the major kind of European war in the post-war period. I mean, yes, we had the Balkans, but this is a larger scale conflict, at least in terms of power on both sides, as it were, especially on the Russian side. You didn't have a comparable kind of conflict in the Balkans, even though you had very serious crimes being committed. Um, and and again, that kind of brings us back to NATO, because of course NATO's search for purpose in the early 90s was kind of resolved by the Balkan Wars, where it found, hang on, we still have a role in the world. We still kind of have a justification in a post-Soviet era. That's been completely turned on its head by this war. And it's probable that if NATO survives as an alliance into the rest of this century, then it may not be relevant. It may be a redundant alliance, or even a fragmented one between the various powers in Europe and the United States, which increasingly looks detached from it, at least in terms of its politics.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue actually that NATO has been obsolete since the fall of the Soviet Union. Um,
Mm.
I would argue also that and you're right. I think that the war in the Balkans sort of gave NATO a reason to continue existing, but it was the wrong response to that war. We should have been looking at an international UN-led force as peacemakers and peacekeepers, and then international diplomacy, not the central role of NATO. Because what that inevitably led to was NATO's eastward expansion, which I will continue to argue is still at the root of this war. People don't like to hear that because it sounds like it's an excuse. It is not an excuse for Russia's actions. NATO's eastward expansion in no way gives license to Russia to invade Ukraine. But it is exactly what many people, from people on the far left, on the radical left, to figures like Henry Kissinger,
Mm.
uh, warned would happen if NATO continued its eastward expansion. Uh, at the time, I recall just looking at it, and going back 30 years here, but just looking at it, and it's saying this is insane. Of course, Russia right now has to tolerate this because they were so weak after the USSR had crumbled. But that situation was clearly not going to hold forever. And we saw various ways that Russia was already responding to it earlier in Georgia and other places. Um, so I think it comes back when we think about NATO, it just comes back to something we're seeing again in the Persian Gulf. We've seen it in Iraq. We saw it in Vietnam. This use of military force to solve political problems is futile and self-defeating, and in fact just creates bigger problems. It resolves nothing. It creates just a lot of destruction and suffering, and and that's from any point of view. You can look at it from a humanitarian point of view. You can look at it from the point of view of an elite ruling class. The only benefit, I suppose, on that end is the enormous revenue that it generates from military spending. And we've just seen another NATO summit where everybody, we're watching Mark Rutte just talking so proudly about all the money that all of these countries are committing to spend for defense. And you ask, defense against what? I mean, seriously, are we seriously talking about defense against Russia? Are we talking about defense against China, which has, is weathering all of these storms so much better than the United States? And it's getting, when we think about China getting hit by the energy crisis, the global energy crisis caused by the Iran war, they have weathered it. They've been hit harder by it because so much more of their oil came out of the Persian Gulf than the West, and yet they've been able to weather it better. Why? Because they have all of these renewable energy sources, because they have an infrastructure that can deal with that, because they're not spending, most of their national budget on the military like the United States does, and like the United States is pressing more and more European countries to do. It is a self-defeating strategy. It always has been. It's not to say that we disband all of our militaries it, but uh, and it's not only about the spending. It's the spending to justify that spending leads to turning to the military to solve these problems rather than diplomacy, which is, it's slower in the sense that diplomacy, you don't see any action. People talk, people talk, people talk, and that can go on for months and months and months, and you don't see any action. There's no actual result. With the military, one way or another, you see results. Things are blown up. You see things that happen, and it tends to be more satisfying. But it's not a good strategy, and we've seen how that thinking, I think, um, comes back to bite us in both the Persian Gulf and in Ukraine. Now, obviously, in Ukraine, Russia invaded. It had to be addressed. It had to be, there needed to be a military response, but that was all there was for a long time. And there still hasn't been a serious effort. There've been these high-profile meetings but there has not really been a serious, sustained effort to come to a resolution of this war. And the time is now. Both sides have the impetus, going back to the same point, I realize, but both sides have the impetus to do that, and they should do it. And if that means that NATO no longer exists, I think we're all better for it, frankly.
Certainly, if we can put in place a more stable and humane alternative, which sounds quite wishy-washy, but like if you go back to the 1990s, there was a brief moment where it was possible to, wrap up NATO and build an alternative kind of mutual security infrastructure with Russia and Europe, which would have allowed countries like Ukraine to have their autonomy, because they wouldn't have been kind of hosts to military bases pointed at Russia potentially. The whole setup of NATO and its kind of anti-communist foundations during the Cold War, it points towards this kind of aggressive standoff.
Yeah.
And here we are. And again, it's one of many ironies in this that NATO's kind of raison d'etre has been kind of exposed as a kind of farce, that it can't defend the West, and that it isn't really going to quote unquote stand up to Russia, because actually it was about calling bluffs. And when Putin invaded Ukraine, he called NATO's bluff.
Yeah, I mean, imagine if there would have been a real. One can only wonder what would have happened if Ukraine was a NATO member,
Mm, mm,
which was an idea, which was one of the reasons actually that one of the factors that pushed Putin to launch the attack is the fear that that could happen somewhere in the future. He knew it wasn't going to. I mean, he said things to that effect, but I'm sure he understood that wasn't going to happen for a number of years. But I don't think he wanted to wait that long, and that should be for him a legitimate concern. It is. It is also something that robs us of a sort of rational way of thinking. I look, NATO was set up to counter Soviet influence, and there was a certain sense to that. But on the whole, I think a series of bilateral defense agreements and security pacts, bilateral or even multilateral ones and regional ones. We're saying I keep coming back to the Middle East, but we're seeing now talk in the Persian Gulf about setting up regional security arrangements. This is something that Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Egypt, so we're talking a pretty big triangle there,
yeah.
have been talking about putting together since this, since even before this war started. Uh, Basically, because they did not want to rely on the United States to provide security anymore. And that is a very good idea. They should not rely on us to do that, both for betterment of the United States and because the United States is an unreliable security guarantor that has been, I think, made abundantly clear. So yeah, there are clear alternatives to NATO, and there's certainly alternatives to some system that says you have to spend this much of your gross domestic product on the military. That is, we're seeing Spain bucking that, and I think that's a great thing. There's a lot that Spain's doing that led so many of us to root for them in the World Cup. Um, and we need to see more of it. We need to see more of this, that kind of basic common sense in terms of international relations.
It's a good point, actually, that we could have stressed a bit more that the Spanish government, they are the outliers in all of this. They are taking very good steps generally in so many areas of policy, including foreign policy. But they can't swing the whole of Europe alone, sadly. You need a shift in France, in Germany, in Britain, and and in Italy, of course. But we're not seeing it. And
Well, maybe we're seeing the first signs in Germany. Maybe
well,
that meeting
maybe,
in Azerbaijan shows us something. I hope.
maybe.
I'm clutching at straws here. I know, but I hope.
No, it's important to have some hope, isn't it? As much as I look on with skepticism as the UK is probably going to fall in line with the rest of European NATO countries and boost its defense budget. But we will hold out for any sign of an interesting agreement, or at least some kind of negotiation from the back rooms of Azerbaijan, I suppose. um, and on that note, that's all for this week. Thanks for listening. This has been Globalists.